The Quran affirms the inspiration, preservation, and authority of the gospel. And yet, our Muslim friends tell us that the gospel has been corrupted. And no matter how many times I show our Muslim friends what the Quran really says, no matter how many times I challenge them to show me a single Quran verse that says the gospel has been corrupted, they continue insisting that the Quran says something completely different from what it actually says. Since they haven't read the Quran, they always seem to assume that there must be some verse somewhere in the Quran that says the gospel has been corrupted because that's what their sheikhs and imams tell them it says. Fortunately, there is a way for all of us to finally get to the bottom of this. There is a way to settle this dispute and see who's right and who's been duped by lying sheikhs and imams. In this video, we're going to read every single verse in the Quran that mentions the gospel. If you're watching this and you're a Muslim, you're about to learn way more about what the Quran says about the gospel than your sheikhs and imams will ever tell you. They do not want you to know this, so they hide it from you. If you're watching this and you're a non-Muslim, you're about to have some awesome material for some very interesting conversations with your Muslim friends. You're about to go from beginner to expert level. Now, to ensure careful reasoning as we go through these verses, let's set up two hypotheses here at the beginning, and then we'll go through the Quran and see which hypothesis is confirmed by the evidence. My hypothesis, we'll call it the D-Wood hypothesis, is this. According to the Quran, Allah gave different revelations to different groups of people through different prophets, and those different groups are responsible for obeying the scriptures that were revealed to them. Christians received the gospel through Jesus. The gospel is still reliable and authoritative, and Christians are commanded to judge by the gospel, not by the Quran. That's the D-Wood hypothesis. If the D-Wood hypothesis is correct, Muslims face two major problems. First, the Quran sounds like it's saying that Allah gave a book called the Gospel to Jesus, and that Jesus then gave this book to his followers. But the Quran says that Christians still have the Gospel, and that Christians have to judge by the Gospel. Since Christians have never had a book that was given by Jesus, Allah apparently doesn't know what he's talking about. Second, in the Quran, Allah really seems to think that the gospel that Christians still have agrees with the Quran, when it clearly doesn't. Since Allah affirms our scriptures when our scriptures contradict the Quran, Allah once again doesn't know what he's talking about. So, that's my hypothesis, and those are the two main problems for Islam if my hypothesis is correct. Then there's the Muslim hypothesis. We'll call it the standard Islamic narrative. The standard Islamic narrative is this. According to the Quran, Allah gave different revelations to different groups of people, but they were all corrupted except the Quran. Christians received the gospel through Jesus, but they corrupted it. The gospel is not reliable or authoritative, and Christians must now judge by the Quran, not by the gospel. That is what you believe, isn't it, my Muslim friends? That is what your sheikhs and imams tell you, isn't it? There's just one problem for the standard Islamic narrative: the Quran. Let's go through the Quran and read every single verse that mentions the gospel so we can see which hypothesis is correct. Now, there are only 12 verses that mention the gospel. If you're taking notes, the verses are Surah 3, verse 3, Surah 3, verse 48, Surah 3, verse 65, Surah 5, verse 46, Surah 5, verse 47, Surah 5, verse 66, Surah 5, verse 68, Surah 5, verse 110, Surah 7, verse 157, Surah 9, verse 111, Surah 48, verse 29, and Surah 57, verse 27. Some of these verses are perfectly clear on their own, so we can read those on their own. Some of the verses require a bit of context. For those, we'll read some of the surrounding context. All right, let's confirm a hypothesis and disconfirm another hypothesis. First up, Surah 3, verse 3. We'll read verses 2 through 4 for context. God, there is no God but He, the living, the self-subsisting. He sent down the book upon thee, upon Muhammad, in truth, confirming what was before it. So the Quran confirms what came before it. And He sent down the Torah and the Gospel aforetime as a guidance to mankind. And He sent down the criterion, truly those who disbelieve in the signs of God shall have a severe punishment, and God is mighty, possessor of vengeance. There are a few interesting pieces of evidence here. Surah 3, verse 3 obviously affirms the inspiration of the Gospel. It says that Allah sent down the Torah and the Gospel. The verse says that the Quran confirms what was before it and then clarifies that it's referring to earlier revelations. English translations obscure another important piece of evidence here. When the Quran is said to confirm what was before it, does this just mean before it in time? Is the Quran only saying that the Torah and the Gospel were reliable when they were originally revealed, but not necessarily later? Or does it mean something much more significant? Well, the Arabic phrase translated as before it is mabaina yadayhi, which literally means between his hands or between its hands. When used as an idiom, mabaina yadayhi can mean in his presence or in its presence. So it doesn't sound like the Quran is verifying books that came before it but were subsequently corrupted. It sounds like the Quran is verifying books that were still available as it was being revealed. Verse 4 says that Allah revealed the gospel as a guidance to mankind. This means that Muslims who say that the gospel was corrupted early on by someone like the Apostle Paul are telling us that Allah failed. Because if they're right, the gospel was corrupted and didn't guide mankind. And finally, we have Allah warning people that those who disbelieve in His signs, which here refers to His revelations, shall have a severe punishment. So if Allah is affirming not only the inspiration, but also the preservation and authority of the gospel, and Muslims say the gospel has been corrupted, they're going to face a severe punishment from Allah. With such a terrifying warning, you'd think Muslims would investigate this issue a bit more carefully. Putting all of these pieces of evidence together, Allah says that He revealed the gospel. He says that the Quran confirms the gospel. He seems to indicate, via the Arabic phrase mabaina yadayhi, that the Quran confirms texts that were still available in the 7th century. And He says that the gospel was to be a guidance for mankind, not something that was going to be lost or corrupted. I think we can say definitively that Surah 3, verses 3 to 4, strongly support the D. Wood hypothesis over the standard Islamic narrative. Next verse, Surah 3, verse 48. We'll start at verse 45 for context. When the angels said, O Mary, truly God gives thee glad tidings of a word from Him, whose name is the Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, high honored in this world and the hereafter, and one of those brought nigh. He will speak to people in the cradle and in maturity, and will be among the righteous. She said, My Lord, how shall I have a child while no human being has touched me? He said, Thus does God create whatsoever He will. When He decrees a thing, He only says to it, Be, and it is. And He will teach him the book, wisdom, the Torah, and the gospel. Verse 48 is a little confusing because it sounds like it's talking about 4 different revelations. There's the book, and the wisdom, and the Torah, and the gospel. So here, there seems to be a distinction between the book and other revelations. But that's not our concern here. Our only concern is that the angel tells Mary that Allah would teach Jesus the gospel. Since both the D. Wood hypothesis and the standard Islamic narrative claim that, according to the Quran, Allah revealed the gospel through Jesus, this verse confirms neither hypothesis over the other. Next verse, Surah 3, verse 65. We'll start a verse earlier for context. Say, O people of the book, come to a word common between us and you, that we shall worship none but God, shall not associate aught with him, and shall not take one another as lords apart from God. And if they turn away, then say, bear witness that we are submitters. O people of the book, why do you dispute concerning Abraham, as neither the Torah nor the gospel was sent down until after him? Do you not understand? Surah 3 verse 65 simply says that the Torah and the gospel were revealed after the time of Abraham, so there's nothing here that confirms either of our hypotheses over the other. Next two verses, Surah 5 verse 46 and Surah 5 verse 47. These are back to back, so we'll read them together. And in their footsteps we sent Jesus, son of Mary, confirming the Torah that had come before him, and we gave him the gospel, wherein is a guidance and a light, confirming the Torah that had come before him, as a guidance and an exhortation to the reverent. Let the people of the gospel judge by what God has sent down therein. Whosoever judges not by that which God has sent down, it is they who are iniquitous. Lots of important details in these two verses. Allah says that he sent Jesus, confirming the Torah that had come before him. And before him here is what? Bعناية يدعي, which, as we've seen, means between his hands or in his presence. So Jesus confirmed the Torah that was still present in his time. This is significant because we have copies of the Torah from before the time of Jesus, so we know what the Quran is confirming here. Allah says that he gave Jesus the gospel, and that the gospel contains a guidance and a light, and that the gospel confirms the Torah, bعناية يدعي, meaning between his hands or in his presence, and that the Torah contains a guidance and an exhortation. Notice the similarity to Surah 3, verses 3 to 4. In Surah 3, 3 to 4, Allah said that he revealed the Quran. He said that the Quran confirmed the Torah and the gospel that were still available when it was revealed, and he said that the Torah and the gospel were given as a guidance to mankind. Here, in Surah 5, verse 46, Allah says that he revealed the gospel. He says that the gospel confirms the Torah that was still available when it was revealed, and he says that the gospel and the Torah contain a guidance. I have to point out, my Muslim friends, if this is Allah trying to say that the Torah and the gospel have been corrupted, he's doing a really, really bad job of it. Then we have Allah's command and warning in Surah 5, verse 47. Now, if the standard Islamic narrative is correct, this would be a perfect place to tell Christians that the gospel has been corrupted and that they now have to judge by the Quran. But what does Allah say? He says, let the people of the gospel judge by what God has sent down therein. Allah commands Christians to judge not by the Quran, but by what he has sent down in the gospel. Then he gives us a stern warning. Whosoever judges not by that which God has sent down, it is they who are iniquitous. If we don't judge by the gospel, we're iniquitous, we're immoral. There's a fundamental principle in ethics. Ought implies can. If I say you ought to do something, if I say you have a moral obligation to do something, I'm assuming that you can do it. I'm assuming that you have the ability to do it. It would make no sense for me to command you to do something that you can't possibly do. If I tell you, you have a moral obligation to give $1 million to charity right now, that command only makes sense if you have $1 million. If you don't have $1 million, I'm commanding you to do something you can't possibly do, and it's absurd to say you have an obligation to do something you can't possibly do. So, when Allah commands Christians to judge by the gospel and tells us that we're iniquitous if we don't, Allah's command assumes that we still have the gospel. If we don't have the gospel because it's been lost or corrupted, Allah's command makes no sense because he would be commanding us to do something that we can't possibly do. Putting all these lines of evidence together, we can say that Surah 5, verses 46 to 47 strongly confirm the D. Wood hypothesis over the standard Islamic narrative.